freedom of speech and press have long been treasured by those who confine themselves to being civil libertarians. Civil, meaning that economic freedom and the rights of private property are left out of the equation. Freedom of speech cannot be upheld as an absolute, except as it is subsumed under the general rights of property of the individual, emphatically including property right in his own person. The man who shouts fire in a crowded theater has no right to do so because he is aggressing against the contractual property rights of the theater owner and of the patrons of the performance. Aside from invasions of property, however, freedom of speech will necessarily be upheld to the uttermost by every libertarian. Freedom to say, print, and sell any utterance becomes an absolute right in whatever area the speech or expression chooses to cover. Here, civil libertarians have a generally good record, and in the judiciary, the late Justice Hugo Black was particularly notable in defending freedom of speech from government restriction on the basis of the First Amendment of the Constitution. But there are areas in which even the most ardent civil libertarians have been unfortunately fuzzy. What, for example, of incitement to riot, in which the speaker is held guilty of a crime for whipping up a mob, which then riots and commits various actions and crimes against person and property? In our view, incitement can only be considered a crime if we deny every man's freedom of will and of choice, and assume that if A tells B and C, you and him go ahead and riot, that somehow B and C are then helplessly determined to proceed and commit the wrongful act. But the libertarian, who believes in freedom of the will, must insist that while it might be immoral or unfortunate for A to advocate a riot, that this is strictly in the realm of advocacy and should not be subject to legal penalty. Of course, if A also participates in the riot, then he himself becomes a rioter, and is equally subject to punishment. Furthermore, if A is a boss in a criminal enterprise, and as part of the crime orders his henchmen, you and him go and rob such and such a bank, then of course A, according to the law of accessories, becomes a participant or even leader in the criminal enterprise itself. If advocacy should never be a crime, then neither should conspiracy to advocate, for in contrast to the unfortunate development of conspiracy law, conspiring, that is, agreeing to do something, should never be more illegal than the act itself. How, in fact, can conspiracy be defined, except as an agreement by two or more people to do something that you, the definer, do not like? Another difficult zone is the law of libel and slander. It has generally been held legitimate to restrict freedom of speech if that speech has the effect of either falsely or maliciously damaging the reputation of another person. What the law of libel and slander does, in short, is to argue a property right of someone in his own reputation. Yet someone's reputation is not and cannot be owned by him, since it is purely a function of the subjective feelings and attitudes held by other people. But since no one can ever truly own the mind and attitude of another, this means that no one can literally have a property right in his reputation. A person's reputation fluctuates all the time, in accordance with the attitudes and opinions of the rest of the population. Hence, speech attacking someone cannot be an invasion of his property right, and therefore should not be subject to restriction or legal penalty. It is, of course, immoral to level false charges against another person, but once again, the moral and the legal are, for the libertarian, two very different categories. Furthermore, pragmatically, if there were no laws of libel or slander, people would be much less willing to credit charges without full documentation than they are now. Nowadays, if a man is charged with some flaw or misdeed, the general reaction is to believe it, since if the charge were false, why doesn't he sue for libel? The law of libel, of course, discriminates in this way against the poor, since a person with few financial resources is scarcely as ready to carry on a costly libel suit as a person of affluent means. Furthermore, wealthy people can now use the libel laws as a club against poorer persons, restricting perfectly legitimate charges and utterances under the threat of suing their poorer enemies for libel. Paradoxically, then, a person of limited resources is more apt to suffer from libel and to have his own speech restricted in the present system than he would in a world without any laws against libel or defamation. Fortunately, in recent years, the laws against libel have been progressively weakened so that one can now deliver vigorous and trenchant criticisms of public officials and of people in the public eye without fear of being subject to costly legal action or legal punishment. Another action that should be completely free of restriction is the boycott. In a boycott, one or more people use their right of speech to urge, for whatever reasons, important or trivial, that other people cease to buy someone else's product. If, for example, several people organize a campaign, for whatever reason, to urge consumers to stop buying XYZ beer, this is again purely advocacy, and furthermore, advocacy of a perfectly legitimate act, not purchasing the beer. A successful boycott might be unfortunate for the producers of XYZ beer, but this again is strictly within the realm of free speech and the rights of private property. The makers of XYZ beer take their chances with the free choices of consumers, and consumers are entitled to listen and to be swayed by anyone they choose.